The problem with growing up with privilege is that you broke everything, knowing that mommy and daddy would be able to buy it back. And so you broke your console and phone, knowing that you could always replace them. The problem is that you grew older and started to treat hearts and bodies the same, as if when you break a heart and a body, you can replace them. We tend to love mosaics because they remind us that broken pieces can be made whole and beautiful again, but we forget that the art of mending hearts and bodies is a skill God never shared with us.
I've always loved the arts, I've always loved reading, I've always loved literature, but the first time I ever wrote my own poem was actually in uni. So my undergrad university in my first year, I was in the back of an engineering materials class, and I remember the lecture was Indian. It was a hot day. I was bored out of my mind, and I sat at the back of the class, I was doodling, I was playing around. I was like, actually, I like poetry. Let me see what could happen if I tried to write my own poems. And before that, I'd go to poetry events, I would perform some of my friends' poems, I'd read out other people's poetry, but I never wrote anything for myself. So we had a class on Monday, and the uni that I went to had a writers' club on Thursdays. So I wrote the poem, I looked at it a couple of times, and I recited it on the Thursday. It wasn't too bad, and I just kept writing after that. So I've been writing for about 7 years now, since undergrad, and at first I used to write for fun, and then after a year or two I was like, this is what I want to do for a very long time, and I started considering it my job and actively writing and producing material and performing. So yeah, it's been you could argue a long journey. Inspiration is a hard thing, but the best place for me to get inspiration is the things that I observe. So when I'm having conversations with people, the little quirks of life, those things really inspire me. And then apart from that, a big source of inspiration has been my family. So having conversations with my dad, seeing the things that my sister would do with my mom, watching the way my friends react with their friends, and trying to notice everyday life from a different lens. So what I find most interesting are normal things that you might see in every day, but seeing a different twist to them. And some of the poems that I love the most come from seeing everyday things, but explaining them or looking at them from a different angle. So I would consider that sort of inspiration, but sometimes it just comes to you. You see something and you're like, oh wait, I never thought about it like that. And from there, it's just, the poem starts to flow out.
She wasn't asking for it, my son. Her clothes do not beg on you, my son. Walking at night is not an invite into her light, my son. Being under the influence is no excuse, my son. This is not a win.
I think I'm more retrospective as a poet. So I mainly love storytelling. I like to evoke emotion, but I'm not a big fan of evoking emotions that I don't think are true to me. And so if I do feel something is true and let's say I'm angry about it from a political standpoint, I will speak about it. If I feel something from a love point, from a family point, from a friendship point, I want to speak on those things. But I don't want to box myself in just being an activist poet or just a love poet, because there was times where I only did love poems. And I was like, wait, there's more to life and there's more to me than just one specific topic. So at the end of the day, I want to speak on things that I think are true and that I really relate with, and in a manner that other people can also relate with. I think that's a really interesting question, because I think poetry is a vehicle, right? It's something that helps us process emotion and also carries us through things. And so for me, poetry has been an escape during some of my toughest times. So I've been able to express myself, to be able to write, and then to be able to heal by letting those things go through poetry. And so I think that's how it's helped me through some times. Just by being able to be honest with myself, to write down my truth without feeling judged, but also I don't have to release that poetry, right? It's just for me, helping me through that time. And some poems do go out, but they're a bit filtered because, not everyone has my story, but for me, it's what I've used to express myself and heal. Being an artist in general in 2023 has been different, right? We're post-pandemic, so we've gone through a couple of years where we're indoors, people really couldn't perform. That came with its own good things in that people were at home and were watching more. So if you're doing things online, a lot more people could discover you. But now we're having the challenge of having to build an audience again, build a culture of being outside and performing. And so that takes time to build again, to build people's trust, to build stories. And the other tough thing that's happened is we've all experienced a lot of trauma. and we may or may not know it. So as an artist, to be able to create sometimes from a place of trauma can be hard because you don't really have the words for you to say yet, because you're still healing, you're still processing. And so I think it's been an interesting time in terms of how do we create, how do we build an audience again, and then how do we engage that audience. But happy to be outside, happy to be performing again, happy to be sharing stories again, interacting with people without fear. And I'm sure the future is bright from here. Like, more people can get outside, earn as well, because again, during the pandemic, it was very hard for you to work. There was no work. So I'm happy that, you know, we're past that 2023, and it's about rebuilding the structures and the foundations that we had to keep going with work. So like Rwanda and Malawi, even just as countries, are quite similar in many ways, right? They're quite small, landlocked countries, still discovering themselves and trying to path out what that looks like. So for me, it was interesting because the crowds were sort of similar in terms of size, in terms of how long people have been doing it. And so, you know, here I think poetry has between 13 to 15 years, which is around the same back home. A lot of the poets that are currently here now are like second generation poets, so they only have a layer above them in terms of people to learn from and do things. So here the differences are also language changes. So there's a lot of Kinyarwanda, and like there used to be Francophone and now it's Anglophone. So transitioning within languages, but also hearing people perform in multi-languages to express themselves has been quite interesting. But the scene is also quite sectored in that there's no like one central location, which has its pros and cons, because it means other people are building from different locations and not from one point, but at the same time you also have hubs where people can go to learn how to express themselves. So those things are quite different. In Malawi, it's sort of, you know, sort of where to go to find the poets. For us, there's only a divide in terms of language, in terms of like English and Chichewa, which is our local language, but they are both budding and growing, so that's where they sort of converge. The one interesting thing for me, though, has been people in Rwanda don't react. Like, it took me a long time to realize whether people are liking the stuff or not, because people would just look at you. And somebody recently told me, actually, when they're paying attention, they like your poetry. So they might not shout or clap, but if they're paying attention, they're liking it. If they're having a sad conversation, it means they're not liking it. And so over time, I was very confused on stage because I'm used to people like reacting, so they're voicing back, they're talking back. But that's also slowly growing in the way people are able to express themselves as they receive poetry. But yeah, I think both scenes have their own pros and cons, and they're all growing and finding their footing. And I think in a few years, you have a very budding poetry scene, even in Kigali. And for me, the growth part has been learning how to write poetry without an overarching context of the location, because I need poetry to be relatable even without knowing the people or the country. And so that does require a bit of research of what people like in the country, but also not writing to a specific audience, writing to people in general, so that my work doesn't have to be good enough for only Malawi or only for Rwanda, but it can be good enough for Africa and the world, and people can be able to understand it regardless of where they come from. So yeah, it's been a lot of learning, but I've loved it so far.